about the Labor History Center, since I have people here. You probably know that Ted and Cheryl Ackerman bought the old Minor Bank building on Park Street. Many of you may remember it as the old Uptown Post Office. They bought that building, and in where the post office was, that's 49 West Park Street, is going to be this Butte Labor History Center. We are incorporated. We are applying for IRS nonprofit status. We have 4 sponsors for banners, the things like you have in the lobby down here at the archives that will be interpretive banners about the Butte labor history story. Ted has been going great guns making the walls happen on the inside. I don't care about that. Well, I care about it. I'm not in charge of it. It's like he's asking me questions. I'm like, oh yeah, that's great. That's fine. That's wonderful. And so we are aspiring to having a couple of these interpretive banners done by January. And at that point, we plan to have, it's not right to call it an opening. There won't be enough to open, but an informative open house. Let's call it that. Where we want to invite the public and especially the unions, because we hope that the unions will become some of our sponsors, meaning give us money, to make these things happen, just to show people what the intent is. That's all that would be, hopefully sometime in January, so you can watch for that. Now, my next picture here is obviously the Maiwa, and you're saying, I thought he was talking about the coal strike of 1919. I am, but this is where it started, in my mind anyway, in terms of discovering this thing. Back in the summer, in August and early September, our volunteer at the Maiwa, his name is Tom Nance. Many of you probably don't know him, he's relatively new to Butte, but he was working aggressively in our basements there to clear out all the junk and chunks of wood, and you cannot imagine. I mean, not artifacts, we're not talking about good stuff, we're talking about you couldn't even go into those basements without crawling on all fours because it was so piled high with trash, is what it really amounted to. So Tom's spinning all this stuff out. By the time he gets under the sidewalk here, there is a vaulted sidewalk space here, as there are in so many places in Butte. What he started finding were chunks of coal. Well, long story short, there is a manhole cover right here in the sidewalk, which was the portal, the delivery portal for coal into the vaulted sidewalk space. Then the boys, the Chin boys, would take the coal out of the building and up the stairs. It used to be on the west side here, up to the noodle parlor, rather than carrying bags or buckets or whatever of coal through the building, through the noodle parlor to the stove that's back there. They took it outside and up this stair, which is now gone. Okay, fine, wonderful. That led us to start investigating the question of where does the coal come from and a few other kinds of questions. And to work on that, my intent was, I came over here to the archives, I wanted to get a photo of just a nice advertisement from a coal company to illustrate whatever I was going to say about the whole thing. That's a nice, reasonable, easy thing to do, right? So I thought, well, November, that's when the coal companies will be advertising. So I happened to pick out a newspaper from November 1919. I don't know why I picked 1919, that's just what I happened to pick. I flipped the paper open, there are no advertisements for coal because there is no coal, because this coal strike is on. And I didn't know about this. How many of you have even heard of the coal strike of 1919? Okay, great. That's more than me. And if I say things that you think are wrong, you have to yell at me, all right? Because I'm telling you that when I got more and more into this, this is one of the most complicated stories I've ever tried to investigate. Not so much the Butte part of it, and I'll be telling that story just with headlines in the paper mostly, but the national reasons for it and the complications of what was going on in 1919 is boggling. And it's a bunch of stuff that I most assuredly did not know. So I'll try to share that with you, but bear with me if I seem like I get lost a little bit or have to refer to my notes a little bit, because it was really, really pretty complicated. So it started here with the discovery of coal that probably dates to the 1930s. Butte got natural gas for the big businesses and some homes, at least, in the early 1930s. I don't know how long. Different homes in different parts of the city, of course, would have used coal quite a bit longer. But the early 30s is when natural gas started to become the main source of heat for the city of Butte. A big gas field was discovered here in Montana, and that's where that started from. So all of that is what led to all of this. So the national situation in 1919. World War I had ended a year ago. November 11th, 1918. You think that's a good thing, right? Well, it's complicated, as they would say on Facebook. It's not all that straightforward, especially for Butte. Because what did it mean? It meant that the demand for copper was declining, actually quite precipitously. So the job situation in Butte was complicated because mines were laying off workers or not having as much work as they had during the peak time of the war. The influenza epidemic was more or less done by this November. I'm sure people were still kind of running scared from it from the previous year. In Butte, about 1,200 people had died, mostly in October, November, December 1918. So things were definitely complicated, at least in people's minds because of that. I already mentioned the demand for copper was down. And you all know about the hyper-patriotism that existed in Butte and across the United States during World War I, the anti-German hysteria mostly. But it wasn't just anti-German, it was anti-unpatriotic. You know, you didn't have to be pro-German. If you just said anything nasty about the company or a lot of other things, if you spoke the words in German in the state of Montana, you could be arrested, as some people were. That switched. And I'm not sure at all how that happened in terms of the national psyche. But by 1919, this had become what's called the first Red Scare, the first fear of communism and Bolshevism and things like that. 1917 was the Russian Revolution. This was going on. This was well known. And in Butte in particular, because we had the radical labor elements, we had the radical Finnish elements that had embraced some of that complicated socialism that was practically communism. I'm sure that the theater of all of this was pretty noticeable, let's at least say that, here in Butte. So that was going on. And Woodrow Wilson, the president, on October 2nd, had his stroke. He had been out and about across the country stumping for the U.S. to sign the Treaty of Versailles and to join the League of Nations. This was an uphill battle for various reasons. That's probably a whole other story that I don't really want to try to get into. But he was. He collapsed in Pueblo, Colorado on September 25th, 1919. They got him back to Washington, and he had his stroke on October 2nd. It was a debilitating stroke. And it's difficult to tell to what extent he was completely incapacitated. You can read many things that say that effectively his wife, Edith, was the power, or at least the authority, if not the power, that drove the country at the presidential level. It also meant that the cabinet, the president's cabinet, was kind of operating as a committee of the whole in terms of the executive branch, but without a head. My understanding is that Wilson went to cabinet meetings, but he almost was just kind of propped up in the chair there and did not really truly participate. He was paralyzed on one side, he could hardly speak, he was blind in one eye, and it was complicated. So all of this is the setting for the early winter of 1919. The Red Scare, to elaborate a little bit on this, these are some of the components of it. What was called the Red Summer of 1919 was a time of strikes, a time of race riots, a time when anarchists like Emma Goldman there, who did come to Butte multiple times around 1910, 1912, were being deported. She was deported. She was a U.S. citizen, deported from the United States to Russia in November of 1919, the same time frame as all this that we're talking about. And the anti-unionism was, as near as I can tell, it was fundamentally a way for corporations to try to break unions by casting them in the light of Bolshevism, of communism, of this Red Scare. There is no doubt that they used the rhetoric and the words, and so did many politicians, and so did much of the press, to vilify the unions. Now, some of that's just being pissed off at people who go on strike, because you, the people, don't get your normal services anymore. But a lot of it was this concerted effort, as far as I can tell, to really put wedges into the unions, between the unions and the people, and all manner of stuff. Again, very complicated. And the anarchists were out and about doing stuff too. And when I say anarchists here, we're talking in many cases literally about anarchists. People who wanted to overthrow the government completely. Now, on the whole, there was not a concerted effort. I mean, they're anarchists. They don't have much of an organization. But individuals were out there doing stuff. And Emma Goldman, who actually had been implicated with other anarchists in the assassination of William McKinley back in 1901, she was exonerated from that, but she was high on the list. When she came to Butte in 1910, she was called the most dangerous woman in America. Mostly she just talked about anti-prostitution and things like that, but nonetheless, that was the image that she had in the United States in the 19 teens. The race riots were complicated too. The African Americans who had gone to fight in World War I came back with, let's just call it a broader view of the world, and let's also say a higher self-image of themselves. They were people. They were not slaves. They were not even descendants of slaves. They were as human as everybody else. They had fought in the Great War. They had done their duty for God and country and everything else. They came back with this new desire for equal rights. And in many ways, the race riots of 1919, my perception of it, and I guarantee I've not read it extensively, is that it really was the first civil rights for black people that really aggressively happened in the United States. And it was caused by the returning soldiers, the black soldiers that came back from World War I. This was to the point that even Woodrow Wilson himself said, let me find it here so I can quote it, "The American Negro returning from abroad would be our greatest medium in conveying Bolshevism to America." I mean, what a thing to say. I mean, that's nasty. President Wilson said this. And this was caught up by the anti-union businesses, the steel companies, the coal companies. I don't know what extent the Anaconda Company did it, but the corporations were latching onto this. There were a couple dozen riots in practically all of the big eastern cities. This was also fed by another consequence of World War I, which was that because two things happened. Young men went to fight in Europe, and no immigrants were coming in from Europe. The northern industrial states had a lack of manpower. They went south and they recruited black people. The first mass migration of blacks from the south to the north happened right during and after World War I. They call it the Great Migration. 500,000 black people had moved north between 1915 and 1919. So that created tension because there was the perception among the working class people in the north that they were taking their jobs. Well, to an extent they were, probably. Anyway, all of this boiled over into these race riots and lynchings, thousands of lynchings in the time frame of the late 19-teens. Wilson railed against the lynchings, and yet he said what I just read, too, about them bringing Bolshevism into America. So the four big strikes, and there were more than these four, but four big strikes happened. January 19, across the city of Seattle for 5 days, everything shut down. Everything that could work stopped work. It was a general strike in the true communist kind of a sense of a general strike. The Boston police strike in September was a big deal. Here's this quote right here about the Boston police strike. "Bolshevism in the United States is no longer a specter. Boston in chaos reveals its sinister substance." That's the kind of rhetoric that was all over the place, stirring people up. And in many ways, it echoes, and I'm too young to really remember it, but McCarthy era radicalism by the politicians as well. The steel strike was also in September, and then the 1st of November is when the coal strike started across the country. So here's the setting for this. The coal miner's wage in 1919 was effectively about that, not quite $900 a year. Poverty level was $2,200 a year. They were well below the poverty level. By 1921, the wage was up to that amount there. The day rates were, as you see there, and this is, I'm calling this effective day rate because the companies, of course, promoted it. Well, we're offering $3.50 a day, $5 a day, whatever it was, but they never got to work 6 days a week. There were extra people after the war, plenty of people to go around, and the mines were, especially the coal mines, much more than our copper mines, were shut down on a regular basis. So effectively, you might get 200 days a year. So that's the basis for this thing I'm calling effective day rate here. And the nominal day rate is what it actually said on the timesheet. You're getting paid $7.50 a day in 1921. So changes were happening, no question about it. But they weren't happening fast enough, and they weren't happening in an adequate amount as far as the miners were concerned. Also, the coal miners and many others across the United States had agreed during the war to not even to ask for any raises, because the war effort was in progress. To support the war effort, we will not demand raises. Now, the price of coal did go up, and the coal companies did make more money. They made a lot of money. So now, a year after the war is over, the coal miners are saying, we now want to recoup some of what we have earned by having refrained from taking a raise for the past 6 years, or whatever the number was. So that's the proximal cause. The wages and working conditions and all those normal kind of things that people go on strike for is what the proximal cause of this was within the setting of everything else that I've been trying to say to you there. So these are the two guys, the two main guys. This is Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, and this is John L. Lewis, the president of the American Federation of Miners. But that's not what it is. It's the coal union. I can't think of what the coal union is, but it's the
United Mine Workers.
United Mine Workers.
Thank you. United Mine Workers of America.
You put UNW.
Oh, no, that would be United Mine Workers. Thank you for looking at my own slide. John L. Lewis, in 1919, had just become the acting president. He was finally fully elected president in 1920, and he served as president of the United Mine Workers until 1960. John L. Lewis is the face of coal mining and mining in general in America for 40 years. So after, in the run-up to the immediate strike on November 1st, Palmer here, and to give him some, I don't know if the right word is credit, the anarchists had tried to assassinate him twice during the summer. His family barely escaped being blown up when somebody set off a bomb on his front porch. So you can see where he's kind of coming from. He's got some baggage. On October 31st, he got a court injunction to prevent the strike, so the next day they went on strike. It's like, no, you can't tell us this. We're walking out. Well, John Lewis, as the leader of the union and other leaders in the union, they were personally threatened with arrest, criminal arrest. So on paper and officially, he told all the miners, no, we can't do this. This is unpatriotic. No strike. Well, that didn't go over. That did not happen. The strike began, and the strike persisted. So, depending on how you read it, one more, there you go. Conservatively, 400,000 coal miners went on strike on November 1st. You'll also see numbers as high as 600,000. All of the bituminous coal miners in the United States went on strike, pretty much. So, big deal. All right, now, I hope you've sort of got as much as I can give you, because this is all I can give you in terms of the background setting for all this. The rest of this will just be the way that it impacted Butte and things here. And this will be pretty straightforward, I think. We'll see. Oh, and plenty of politics, plenty of political cartoons. The goblin in the coal bin, there's this coal strike, you know, attacking the Halloween handouts and things like that. Uncle Sam is sick and tired of it. He's spanking the labor unions. This is very much the kind of thing that was pervasive in the press. The press was very clearly anti-union. That's across the country. You know about it here in Butte, that the press was owned by the companies, by Clark and the Anaconda Company and so on. But across the country, pretty much, the unions were vilified in the press as well. And putting out the fire of the industrial resurgence. That's the other attitude. You know, come on, people, we're just getting going after the war. We got to make this happen. So, you know, calling on patriotism and your desire for progress, things like that. So all kinds of political cartoons. So here's the November 1st newspaper. The Butte miners' strike goes into effect. And look at the kind of things that are going on. The building's mayor has seized all the coal in buildings. Butte is prepared, if necessary, to seize the fuel and to create a distribution system. That happened within about a week. All kinds of stuff is going on. Here's Mayor Stodden's proclamation, and Wayne here, his great-grandfather? Yes. He's the great-grandson of the mayor of Butte at this time, and he has some interesting letters that pertain to this that maybe he can show after the talk is over. So, big news, very big news. And I should also point out too that when you go back and forth, you all have probably done this a lot, but going back and forth between the Standard and the Miner clearly was the more sensation-seeking newspaper. Red headlines all the time. The Standard is kind of more like the New York Times in terms of its presentation. At least that's my perception of it from this time frame. The information's all out there, but they spread it out a little bit differently in some cases. We're up to November 3rd now. The troops are coming out to the coal states. This is not including Montana yet. The two main mines in Montana that served, well, most of the state, but Butte in particular, one was at Roundup, which is north of Great Falls. The other was at Bear Creek, which is not too far from Red Lodge. Those were the two main coal producing centers that served Butte in this time frame, actually for most of this time frame. The company, the Anaconda Company, had its own coal mines at Diamondville, which is near Kemmerer in southwestern Wyoming. Different grade of coal, not really adequate for the kind of coal that you would use in your house or in your boilers and things like that. So that was the setting in Butte. 3 primary sources, 1 for industry and 2 for commercial and residential, and the commercial and residential was shut off on November 1st. Railways told to seize all the shipments. The railways were the largest consumers of coal in the country because that's what made a railroad go. So to keep transportation lines and other kinds of deliveries going, that's why the railroads were so vested in having the coal available directly to them. Okay? Gompers, Samuel Gompers was the president of the American Federation of Labor. That was an organization of unions. And he stepped in to try to make something happen, but he gave up really quite quickly. While this is all going on, here we're up to November 8th, a few other things were happening in Butte. Who recognizes this gentleman? No? It's Emmett de Valera.
Yeah.
Oh my. The president of Ireland on his second visit to Butte on this day, November, whatever it was, 8th, 1919. So, this is the problem when you go to look things up in the Butte newspapers. You get distracted by other really cool things that are going on. Like Emmett de Valera just happened to be in Butte that day too. So, we're still in early November. We're still trying to negotiate and make a few things happen. I believe November 8th or November 9th was the day when John L. Lewis told the strikers go back to work, and they did not. In the early part of November, they can still laugh at it. Here's the cartoon in the Butte Miner. When strikes become universal. This one is the cabinet at Washington walked out yesterday. They demand shorter hours and more pay. Oh, the Federation of American Mothers threw down their tools this morning and walked out. They demand a 12-hour day with 1 afternoon off every month. At present, they are working 24 hours a day for their board and lodging with no time off. Troops are being rushed to the scene to put the mothers down.
We still haven't won that one.
The doctors' union has declared a strike beginning at midnight. The school children's union walked out in a body yesterday. They have many grievances. Shorter hours and more recesses. The convicts union has presented its irreducible demands in the form of an ultimatum submitted yesterday. Shorter hours, more time to spend with their wives and children. And the Municipal Water Works Union of America struck the day before yesterday. For 2 days, America has been without water. You know, this is all a joke. But they were poking fun at the whole thing. Well, this is early November. They could still do that. It wasn't quite so bad yet. A few days later, the troops are out there really getting into the thick of things. People started to be shot and killed, and other elements besides the mining elements had to shut down. In West Virginia and in Oklahoma, essentially it was martial law in the cities around the coal fields, and there were no food deliveries made. It was difficult in some of those places. And yet Thanksgiving is on its way here on November 16th. In Butte, November 17th now. This is a photo of someone on the east side breaking up their furniture for fuel. They have now run out of coal. They have no fuel. They're breaking up their chairs. This woman up here, Mrs. Evans, she lived at, I can't read the number, but it's Caledonia Street. She is offering 1 bag of coal, her own meager supply, to the poor people of Butte that need it so that they won't freeze. Because it's getting into later November, it's getting a little colder. But yeah, breaking up furniture happened in mid-November. Meanwhile, life goes on. Prohibition had started the 1st of January of 1919 in Montana, the Montana Prohibition Act, not the national one, which comes the next year. So $3,500 worth of whiskey was destroyed and poured down the sewer.
To burn it.
Too bad, yeah.
Yeah.
We didn't think about burning it. This was from the American House in Walkerville. It was on Daly Street, is where it was located. All right, it's getting even more complicated now. A railway strike. How can you have a railway strike? Well, part of that is that the railroads weren't getting as much as they needed, and the railway workers had the same kind of grievances that everybody else did. You know, they had also foregone raises during the course of World War I, so they had plenty of demands and problems and issues and so on. Well, that at this time is going to make this bad if that happened, because it's everything. You know. We're coming out of winter. We don't have that much food in Butte. Butte relied always on imports coming in for milk and whatever else you want. This is the other headline on the Standard, where they're advertising and they're promoting and reporting on the things that are going on back in Washington. But this little telltale article down here is the bigger deal for locally. The cold wave is about to hit now. We're in Thanksgiving week, and the fuel supply is not getting any better. By this point in time, the Anaconda Company is not burning any of the coal that's coming from Diamondville in Wyoming. All that they are giving to the city fuel administrator to distribute to people that don't have coal. All of it. They are still keeping the mines going because they are burning leftover bad coal, coke, and random stuff that is not really suitable for anything. But they're burning it, and the mines are still operating. Okay? The coal that they're getting, which is barely adequate to keep things going in Butte, is coming from Diamondville, and it's that lower quality stuff that houses and businesses are not used to having for their heat. So it's getting cold. Okay, wonderful. Great news on Thanksgiving Day. The Butte situation is saved by the promise of coal supplies. Because this guy right here, Mr. Lang, he was the traffic manager for the Anaconda Company. And I'm not quite sure what traffic manager means, but it certainly oversaw the deliveries of stuff that the Anaconda Company needed. He went to Salt Lake City. He did a deal with the railroads that would guarantee, I think it's 1,000 tons, which I think is something like 60 cars of coal a day into Butte from Diamondville. You ought to be asking the question, how much do we normally get? I have tried to figure it out, and I don't know, but it's more than 1,000 tons a day is what Butte consumed just for residential use, because 1,000 tons a day was just what the people that had nothing used.
What was the population roughly at that time?
In 1919, depending on exactly how you look at it, the 1918 city directory says 93,000. And in a quote here that we're going to get to in a minute, they refer to about 90,000. So I think that's a fair number. The census in 1920 will have 60,000 in Butte, but it's not that low. All of the censuses undercount the population, probably by many thousands. So I would say that by 1920, when officially in the census it's 60,000, it probably was 70, 75. It definitely was declining as soon as the war ended. Let's call it 90,000 for now. That's what the city official says.
It was at its peak.
That's as high as the population ever got.
Well, the peak really was probably 1917, 1918, and I personally think it's fair to say about 100,000 at that point in time. The city directory, the highest one's 93,000, and I know that they undercount the Chinese, they undercount prostitutes, they certainly don't count a lot of transient workers and so on. I'm not, a bunch of us did a bunch of research because everybody used to say it was the biggest city, you know, from Minneapolis to Seattle. That's not true, because Spokane was bigger. Spokane had 104,000 at the same time. I don't believe Butte ever got to be 104,000. So what I say is about 100,000, and I'll defend to the death my right to say that. So this guy, Mr. Lang, goes down there and gets a deal to make it all happen. Meanwhile, though, we got good things going on in Butte, but generally speaking, across the strike, no solution is in sight whatever on a national basis. So Butte is now relying singly on what they could get from the Diamondville mines in Wyoming, from the Anaconda Company, who's just given it to the city. Now it's getting cold. So we're down to 22 below. It's going to be the coldest Thanksgiving in 20 years. 22 below on Tuesday, 11 below at midnight. 22 below yesterday also. It was 22 below for about 3 days in a row. And the highs were around 0. That's pretty cold. The National Fuel Czar is what we would call it today. It was in Chicago. I guess he was regional. But in any case, everybody, including Butte, had to defer to what they could get from this guy. This guy is telling Butte, well, you should shut the mines down so you don't have to use so they can give their coal to the people. He didn't know they're already doing that, giving them their low-quality coal, the Diamondville coal. He didn't think of the fact that you're going to put 10,000 or more men out of work by shutting down the mines. Do that, and how are they going to buy food, even if they're not working? They don't get paid. That's what's going to happen. So that would have been a humongous disaster for Butte. So this is big news in Butte now, that he wants to shut down the mines in Butte. Well, here's optimism. This becomes whiplash at this point. Whiplash because, oh, the coal mines are going to be open on Tuesday. The governor says so. He's going to make all this happen. Whatever. The Butte situation is more favorable. 12 coals are coming. This would be Diamondville coal. And this is part of that deal with the railroad, I think it's the Northern Pacific, that Mr. Lang had done to get the coal into Butte. Well, that's on November 30th. Now, December 1st, drastic measures nationally. Coal situation still looks brighter in Butte as the week begins. Definitely a dichotomy in what you see on these front pages between the Butte situation and the national situation, at least until tomorrow, which is yesterday, December 2nd. On December 2nd, the miners that were still working for the Anaconda Company in Diamondville joined the strike. And all the shipments from Diamondville stopped. No coal is coming into Butte, and it's a problem. It's becoming a huge problem because they were right on a shoestring already. It was okay, nobody was freezing to death, but it was definitely complicated until now, as you see there, like a bolt from the blue, the distressing news that the Diamondville mines are going to close down. So, what's going to happen? Well, the situation is now desperate, and the fuel dealers in the city are going to meet with the fuel administrator, who was a city official that was charged with figuring out what to do with whatever they did have. Okay, 2 days later, 3 days later, December 5th, coal is coming now, right? Well, sort of, maybe. The governor is now bringing troops in. We're a couple of days later, and it's now officially settled. I say that with a question mark, because that's a wonderful looking headline, but it wasn't true. Well, he thought it was, but the union rejected it, is what it amounted to. So now it's getting colder again. We need this stuff to happen. The city council allocated $5,000, big bucks, to buy food to give to the people that were getting ready to move to shelters because they had no heat. And now, the strike is supposedly over as of yesterday's newspaper. Now, on December 8th, what's going on? All these layoffs in big industries because they cannot get coal to fuel their factories. Whether it be a car factory, a steel factory, whatever. Anything that needed lots of coal can't get it. Hundreds of thousands of layoffs across the United States. And here in Butte, yeah, we were going to get coal yesterday. Not anymore. All but 20 of 28 cars were seized by the railroad because they wanted it and they needed it. Well, sort of is a circular thing, you know. The trains can't run without coal, so they can't bring the coal unless they can use some coal to drive their trains. Nonetheless, they took most of what was going to be coming from Butte. So now Butte's situation is becoming really pretty critical. This guy, John McIntosh, was the Butte administrator, the city official that was in charge of all of the coal distribution and whatever else here. Okay, so now, we're up to December 9th, and the governor has called on anybody, volunteers, the union people would call them scabs, to operate the mines. The level of confidence is increasing over here, because now it's kind of like just down to technicalities. The president's offer on the 7th had been initially rejected by the unions. John L. Lewis was aggressively trying to shut down the radical elements of the union so that they could accept it, because he knew that they weren't going to get everything they wanted. You remember those wage numbers, $3, $4, $5 a day. What they had demanded was a 60% raise, big bucks. What they ended up getting, I'm a little bit ahead here, but they ended up getting a 14% raise. So if it was $5, that's 70 cents, thank you for the math. The strike is technically over, or close to over, and this is still what's going on in Butte. The shelters that were open included the YMCA, the Florence Hotel on East Broadway Street, other places, the Moose Hall, which I'm not sure where it was. In a couple days, the Knights of Columbus becomes a shelter for people, and this is a little bit hard to believe, but it's true. In some neighborhoods, people that had enough coal were bringing their neighbors into their own homes. Now, it's a big deal because that's a class distinction thing there. It's not that they're your neighbor. Maybe you have nothing against your neighbor, but that's a lower class person, and I'm a higher class person. They were bringing poor people into mansions is what it comes down to. And I thought that was pretty cool. There is a pulling together that finally does happen in the neighborhoods. But hundreds of people were being put up in shelters by now, the 9th of December. Luty's is taking advantage of it. Oh yeah, cold weather heating foods. We will sell you all these things. Beef at 12 cents a pound, that's marked down from other prices. Mutton, 16 cents a pound. Olive oil, yeah, we're going to buy a lot of olive oil. But anyway, the advertising reflects the fact of what was going on as well. Relief at hand on December 10th. Because out of that $5,000 that was allocated, the grocers started giving things out to people. And the main issue became one of distribution. How do you get it to the people? How do you make sure it's equitable? How do you make sure it's really a destitute person as opposed to me or whatever? So hundreds of destitute, shivering people were made happy yesterday, and they were stocked by the grocers with fuel also to come in. Okay, this is December 10th. We have a real final agreement now. On December 10th, this is the December 11th paper, the union signed the agreement. The strike truly was over. Everything's supposed to go back to work promptly. Well, we'll see how long it takes. Promptly is promptly, okay? Here's John L. Lewis. Now everybody's happy about him. Everybody's actually happy about Mr. Palmer, except for the coal companies. The coal companies vilified Mr. Palmer for selling out, for you know, cashing in on this deal or whatever. And he was no longer their friend. Meanwhile, December 11th, they're tearing down buildings in Butte to get enough fuel to burn. These are in various places. It's not particularly clear where they all are. All of the stuff that they got from tearing down buildings, they took to the Jefferson School, which was on the east side. I think it was like a Mercury and Shields over there somewhere, and it changed its name later, but it was called the Jefferson School at this time. And now it starts to snow. And now it starts to get really cold. So this is going to disrupt the train traffic that's bringing the coal, that really is bringing the coal now. It shuts down the trolley system in Butte. There you see it, streetcars forced to suspend. Everything was totally paralyzed. I could not find a good measurement, but based on the pictures, I think the next one's a picture, it seems like it's on the order of a foot or more of snow. Somebody had fun. And the traffic, such as it was, really could not go anywhere. You know how it is in Butte when it snows. So,
is that Idaho Street? Is that the house at the top of?
You mean that right there?
Yeah, the tall one sticking up, isn't that the, never mind.
It could be.
It could be. I tried to figure it out, but not too hard. We can work on it later. Besides the blizzard, it's starting to get really cold again now this time. So they could not deliver things to the people. You can see there that we may get some today because the blizzard has ended. Breaking from the grip of the storm. Thousands of families still in need. We're up to December 13th. And now the temperature really
Oh
falls.
my gosh.
They measured 56 below zero. Now, that's not an official record because if you go look it up for this day, that's not what they had down at the airport or wherever the official station was. They had many reporting stations that were all over town. 56 below on the south side, which my perception is that's like Forfrey Street or something like that, would have these kind of numbers. The other day, actually on Thanksgiving, I was with some people and I was mentioning this, and the discussion came up, well, how do you measure 56 below? Because mercury freezes at 40 below. Well, I did not know, but it turns out the alcohol thermometer was invented in 1609. So they had alcohol thermometers, and alcohol thermometers are good down to 94 below. So one presumes that this was measured with an alcohol thermometer.
So Dick, if it was that cold, and we're basically talking about uptown, and we all know it gets way colder even down on the flat, I wonder how cold it was down there.
Well, I think the south side
Really?
was probably the flat because,
But even, we're talking like out by the 5 Mile.
well, they're
like
saying
way
Lake
up
Avoca,
there,
47
yeah.
degrees below zero.
Oh, okay, okay.
So
Montana Power Company,
Yeah.
45 below, that would be down
45.
on Oxford Street.
yes.
So, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So,
That's
cold.
the sum.
So uptown was probably only 38 below.
Oh, yeah, only, yeah.
Comfortable.
Balmy.
So it's cold, and because of the blizzard, and because we were just on the edge anyway, the problem still persists. Now, it's December 13th. The good news is it does actually get better, but here's their Santa Claus
Have to keep
cartoon. What these kids are saying in here is, can't hang the stockings up, gotta keep them on. Please bring some coal.
Yep.
Finally, it starts to get better. A Chinook comes through, except technically it wouldn't be a Chinook. Chinook is a falling body of air, but it got a lot warmer. It rose by 65 degrees in Butte, all the way up to 28 in about a 24-hour period, about here, December 15th. And the coal is finally starting to get through because the coal miners have actually gone back to work. The Butte mines are still closed, though, because they don't have enough coal. So they've been closed, if you remember, since December 2nd. So we're now 2 weeks into it. All these miners that are not working are not getting paid. So they are among those destitute people. They may have some coal, but they don't have any money to buy food. So the relief effort still is ongoing. December 19th, this would be the day of victory. Finally now, there's enough coal that you don't have to regulate it, you don't have to have the fuel administrator saying, you can have some, you can't, you know, things like that. So December 19th is the day that, from the newspapers, I would perceive as the end of this episode, which has now been 6 weeks from the 1st of November. Finally, December 20th, they announced that the mines will reopen, and finally, on December 22nd, they actually go back to work. They've been idle for 20 days. 20 days is a big deal when you're basically living from paycheck to paycheck. Meanwhile, life did go on. This is from November of 1919. Does anyone recognize this building?
It's the, no, it's
No,
the,
Head Frame Spirits.
Head Frame
It is
Spirits.
San Fran Spirits, yes it is.
Oh, yeah.
It's being built as the Buick dealership on the first floor and the dance hall on the second floor, which you've all presumably seen. It was under construction in November of 1919. And Christmas did come and was celebrated. I imagine it was probably a pretty happy Christmas, given that things had gotten back to normal about a week beforehand. The 1902 Butte miner here celebrated Santa coming into town in a car, because a car was a big deal. And in 1919, he came in by airplane.
Woo-hoo.
So it was, I guess, a pretty relatively happy Christmas. It could have been a lot worse that year in 1919, but things did settle down. It wasn't all the way over. There were more coal strikes in the next few years and other kinds of things. The early 20s was a very complicated time as the ramifications of the end of World War I filtered through everywhere. But it was as normal as it could be, way more normal than this 6 weeks that we've just been talking about.